148 of the 151 people who died at Tangiwai were traveling second class. Not because second-class passengers were less lucky, not because the lahar was selective. By standard practice on New Zealand railways, second-class carriages were marshaled at the front of the train. This is the story of a volcanic mudflow that destroyed a railway bridge on Christmas Eve 1953. But the volcanic mudflow explains the bridge. It does not explain the carriages. The Board of Inquiry that followed found no failure to exercise reasonable care. It called the disaster an act of God. What the Board of Inquiry did not ask is the question this episode is about. Mount Ruapehu is the tallest volcano on New Zealand's North Island. It sits in a depression formed by millions of years of eruption and subsidence. At its summit, a crater lake. Not a calm lake, a lake that heats and cools with the volcano's activity. A lake with no natural outlet, only a permeable barrier of tephra, volcanic rock, ash, and debris packed together over decades of eruption and cooling. A tephra dam is not built like an engineered dam. It is not inspected. It is not maintained. It accumulates through geology, and it fails through geology. And there is no regulatory body that governs when it goes. In 1945, Ruapehu erupted. The eruption reshaped the crater, raising the lake's natural dam. When the volcanic activity subsided, the lake began to refill. But now it was filling behind an older, less stable barrier. The chemistry was also changing. Eruptions acidify crater lakes and heat them. As the lake cooled after 1945, it deposited new material against the tephra barrier, not reinforcing it, but adding weight and hydrostatic pressure. Geologists observed the change. By 1953, geologists later measured the crater lake at roughly 8 meters higher than its pre-1945 level. That is 8 meters of additional water pressing against a barrier that had not been engineered to carry increased load. No monitoring system had been installed on the Whangaehu River. No warning protocol connected the volcano to the railway below. The Tangiwai bridge had already survived one lahar. In 1925, a volcanic mudflow came down the Whangaehu and damaged the bridge. The bridge held. No systematic monitoring of the crater lake was established afterward. The logic at the time was that the 1925 event was exceptional. The logic by 1953 was that exceptional had not happened again. That is one way to read the absence of a warning system. Another way to read it is that nobody was required to look. At least 4 lahars had moved through the Whangaehu Valley between the 1840s and 1953. Only one had come after the railway opened, the 1925 event. The bridge had survived it. The record noted it. The monitoring question was never formally raised. New Zealand's Geological Survey had documented the lahar risk on the Whangaehu over the preceding decades. That documentation existed in archives. It was not connected to an alert system. It was not connected to railway operations. 2 separate institutions, geology and transport, shared a valley and did not share a protocol. The geological record and the railway timetable ran parallel to each other and never met. A Wellington to Auckland express passenger service had been running this route for decades. The Wellington-Auckland Night Express was the artery of intercity travel before the automobile made the roads practical. On the night of 24 December 1953, Train 626 carried 285 passengers and crew. It was Christmas Eve. Many of them were traveling to be with family. The train had departed Wellington earlier that evening. It was expected to arrive in Auckland the following morning. For most passengers, the night was a crossing, time in transit before Christmas began. The train's configuration followed standard New Zealand Railways practice. Second-class carriages at the front, first-class carriages at the rear. The reasoning was comfort economics. The front of the train was closest to the locomotive's smoke, soot, and noise. Passengers who paid more paid to be farther from that. Second-class passengers paid less. Their carriages went at the front. This was not a choice made specifically for this night. It was a structural decision made long before Cyril Ellis set out for Christmas. Second class on New Zealand railways in 1953 meant upholstered bench seating in open carriages. First class meant individual compartments, reserved seating, and separation from the noise of the locomotive. The price difference was not large in absolute terms, but it was large enough to sort 176 people into the 5 carriages at the front of the train and 109 people into the carriages at the rear. That sorting was invisible on the platform. It was invisible in the ticket. It became visible only when the bridge gave way. Cyril Ellis was 27 years old. He worked for the Postal Service in Taihape, a small town on the central North Island Plateau. On Christmas Eve 1953, he was driving south with his wife and mother-in-law to visit family. His route crossed the Whangaehu River on the road bridge adjacent to the railway bridge. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. At approximately 8 in the evening, the Tephra Dam at Ruapehu's Crater Lake failed. Not with an explosion, not with a visible eruption. The dam simply gave way. The Crater Lake had been filling for 8 years behind an unstable barrier. When the barrier finally failed, an estimated 340,000 cubic meters of lake water poured into the head of the Whangaehu River. That water picked up everything it touched: volcanic sand, silt, rock, and debris. It became a lahar, a fast-moving mixture of volcanic material and water that behaves less like a flood and more like concrete in motion. The Whangaehu River runs approximately 33 kilometers from the base of Ruapehu to the Tangiwai Bridge. The lahar traveled it in roughly 2 hours. Nobody downstream knew it was coming. As the lahar moved north, it undercut the riverbanks, picked up trees, boulders, and uprooted vegetation, and rolled them forward in a mass that thickened as it traveled. Witnesses downstream described the river as yellow-brown, with volcanic sediment, running well above its normal banks and carrying a sulfurous smell. The flood crest arrived at each point along the river without warning, without sound, and without the preceding rise in water level that a rainfall flood might produce. A lahar does not build gradually. It arrives. At 10:09 in the evening, train 626 departed Waiyuru, the last station before Tangiwai. The 12-minute run to Tangiwai was expected to be unremarkable. The lahar reached the railway bridge at approximately 10:20. It struck Pier 4. Pier 4 was the 4th support column of the bridge. The lahar removed it. The bridge was not immediately destroyed. It was compromised. The superstructure remained standing temporarily over a gap. At approximately 10:15, 6 minutes earlier, Cyril Ellis had found the road bridge adjacent to the railway crossing. The Whangaehu was over the road. The water was yellow, volcanic, rising and falling. Ellis parked his car. He climbed a barbed wire fence along the railway embankment. He ran toward the oncoming locomotive. He waved his torch. The Board of Inquiry later recorded that driver Charlie Parker and fireman Lance Redmond tried to slow down after some warning. Whether Parker saw Ellis's torch, saw the debris in the river, or both, the record does not confirm. What the record confirms is that Charlie Parker shut off the oil supply, applied the emergency brakes, and sanded the rails. A loaded express train in motion required more stopping distance than the bridge allowed. At 10:21 on the night of 24 December 1953, the Wellington-Auckland Night Express reached the Tangiwai Bridge. The locomotive crossed the position of Pier 4. The bridge gave way. The locomotive and the first 5 carriages entered the Whangaehu River. The first 5 carriages were second class. All of them derailed into the lahar-swollen river. The 6th carriage, the first-class carriage, teetered at the broken edge of the bridge. It fell too, but Cyril Ellis and the train's guard, William Inglis, entered it. They helped passengers out through a broken window. 1 first-class passenger died. The other 108 survived. From carriages 1 through 5, the number who survived was 28. The number who died was 148. 20 bodies were never recovered. The river carried them into the Tasman Sea. The carriages in the river were not immediately submerged. Several remained partially visible above the lahar for some time after the collapse. Rescuers worked through the night, in floodwater carrying volcanic debris, in darkness on Christmas Eve, pulling survivors from the river and from the wreckage. Surviving passengers from the 6th carriage helped. Cyril Ellis remained at the site. He was later awarded the George Medal. He was one of several people recognized for their actions that night. The locomotive crew, Charlie Parker and Lance Redmond, received posthumous recognition. The numbers have been available since 1954. 148 dead in second class, 1 dead in first class, 2 dead on the footplate, the driver and fireman. The question of why 148 of 151 victims were second-class passengers has a structural answer. Second-class carriages were always at the front of the train. That was standard practice. The front of the train was noisier, smokier, less desirable. First-class passengers paid to be farther from that. Second-class passengers paid less, and their carriages were placed at the front. When the bridge failed under the locomotive, the first 5 carriages followed it into the river. Those were the second-class carriages. That is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of where the railway's class system placed 176 people on that train. I am not arguing that New Zealand Railways intended for second-class passengers to be in greater danger. The carriage configuration was an economic and comfort arrangement, not a safety decision. But an economic arrangement became a survival arrangement on Christmas Eve 1953. The inquiry answered why the bridge failed. It did not ask why death was distributed so unevenly through the train. On 18th January 1954, Prime Minister Sidney Holland formed a board of inquiry. The board convened for public hearings from 26 January to 2 April 1954. Its report was released on 23 April 1954. The board's scope was defined by the question it was given: what caused the disaster? The answer to that question was geological. Pier 4 had been removed by the lahar. The lahar had been caused by the failure of the Tephra dam. The dam had failed because the crater lake had been filling behind an unstable barrier for 8 years. The board found that chain. It followed it precisely. It documented it accurately. It also found that the train crew had shown no failure to exercise reasonable care, that Charlie Parker and Lance Redmond had fulfilled their duties. The disaster, the board determined, was the result of forces of such nature and magnitude that they could not have been anticipated. An act of God. New Zealand Railways made more than 150 ex gratia payments to survivors and families. These were voluntary payments, not liability admissions. The disaster qualified as an act of God. The railway was not legally required to pay anything. It chose to. I have read the Board of Inquiry's finding. What I see in its language is a careful containment of the question. The board documented the geological cause precisely. It did not document the social anatomy of the dead. It did not ask whether the placement of second-class carriages at the front of the train had shaped the casualty distribution. It did not ask whether a monitoring system on the Whangaehu River, one made possible by the existing geological record, should have been operating by 1953. These are not questions the board was required to ask. They were not in the board's terms of reference. The terms of reference asked about the cause of the disaster and the conduct of railway employees. Both were answered. What the terms of reference did not ask was whether the institutional arrangements that preceded the disaster, the monitoring gap in the carriage configuration, had shaped its outcome. A board of inquiry is not a standing commission. It answers the question it is given. The question it was given was about the night. The questions it was not given were about everything that made the night what it was. Charlie Parker and Lance Redmond, the locomotive crew who applied the emergency brakes and died trying to stop the train, waited more than 60 years for a permanent memorial. The board had praised their conduct. A memorial marker was finally erected in May 2017. The inquiry had the facts it needed to honor them immediately. What it lacked was an institutional mechanism to say, these men acted well, and the system that put them in that position did not. In 2007, Mount Ruapehu produced another lahar down the Whangaehu River. The Eastern Ruapehu lahar alarm and warning system, installed in 2002 in the decade since Tangiwai, detected the initial breach of the crater lake outlet within minutes. Vibration sensors, webcam feeds, and lake-level monitors tracked the lahar in real time. Railway signals on the Tangiwai section were automatically set to danger. Trains were stopped. No one died. The system had been triggered in test conditions and in minor events before 2007. When the actual lahar came, it performed as designed. The same river, the same volcano, the same bridge corridor, a different outcome. What the 2007 lahar changed was not the river. It changed the relationship between the river and the railway. The carriage configuration that placed 176 second-class passengers in the 5 carriages closest to the bridge was standard practice in 1953. The configuration question was never the subject of an inquiry. The Tangiwai disaster did not begin when Pier 4 failed. It began in 1945 when a tephra dam started forming at the outlet of Ruapehu's crater lake, and no mechanism was built to watch it. It was shaped when it came by a carriage arrangement that placed the cheapest passengers at the front. The Board of Inquiry called it an act of God. The geological record calls it a known kind of hazard, one for which no operational warning system existed. I am willing to argue that the casualty distribution, 148 second-class dead to 1 first-class dead, calls it something more specific still. Not a crime, not a conspiracy, a configuration. The monitoring gap and the carriage configuration were both in place before the train left Wellington. Neither was examined by the inquiry that followed. The lahar did not discriminate. The railway had already done that work.